Hello and welcome to episode 13 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to Sarah Phillimore, barrister and gender-critical campaigner, on how the barristers regulator is trying to inject woke ideology into the legal profession.
Equality, diversity, inclusion. Well, what does this mean? Who are you including? Who are you excluding? And what precisely is equal about that?
Stephen Tucker, author and regular Daily Sceptic contributor, on lefty academics' mad plans to decolonise exams.
What the exams test, according to this school of thought, is not actually ability per se, but rather how white your thinking is.
David McGrogan, law professor at the University of Northumbria, on Keir Starmer's liberal authoritarianism and why it can only get worse.
Is there any country in the history of mankind which has managed to achieve growth by paying more money to public sector workers and taxing people more than they're taxed already? I don't think there's a country in economic history that's achieved that.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with the Daily Sceptic's editor, Will Jones, on the cynical campaign to silence our sceptical journalism by self-appointed American News Reliability Index, NewsGuard.
It's been pretty devastating. NewsGuard has been ruthlessly effective in demonetising us. I think we simply are unable to get any advertising.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, it's a basic principle of the common law that no matter how popular or unpopular a defendant is, everyone is entitled to a legal defence. It's known as the cab rank rule, and it's bound barristers in Britain for more than 2 centuries, but perhaps not for much longer. The Bar Standards Board, the barristers' regulator, is currently consulting on a proposal to replace barristers' plain old duty not to discriminate against potential clients with a duty to act in a way that advances equality, diversity, and inclusion. A phrase which, as viewers will know, is synonymous with all kinds of woke activism. So what does this mean? Is EDI ideology entering the law? Well, to find out, I'm very pleased to be joined by Sarah Phillimore, barrister and gender-critical campaigner and the author of Sarah's Substack. Welcome to The Sceptic, Sarah.
Hello.
Okay, so before we get into these proposed changes, I know it's not the first time the BSB has been seen to be wading into politics, and in fact, you've had an encounter with them before, as well as another barrister, John Holbrook, both over things you've said online. Can you just walk us through what happened there?
Right. In 2018, in common, I think, with quite a lot of people, with the government's proposals to reform the process of obtaining a gender recognition certificate, we all, with some horror, woke up to the fact that for many years now, gender identity was being promoted as an organising category which was more important than sex. I mean, I certainly was completely oblivious to this until it all began to kick off in 2018. I therefore decided to speak publicly on social media about what I felt about that, which was horrified. So I was getting lots and lots of complaints to the BSB saying how awful I was, because of course at that pre-Elon Musk era, you had to be extremely careful what you said on Twitter, as it then was. I was suspended for calling somebody he, whatever. So I was dealing with lots and lots of complaints. The BSB were dealing with them sensibly, and they were saying, look, she's allowed to have a political view. She's allowed to express it. She's not trying to hurt anybody. She's not being abusive. But at some point, a woman called Vela Soames, who is an independent reviewer of the BSB and I think works with other professional regulators, said to the BSB, you have to reopen the complaints that you've rejected because she is displaying a course of conduct and she is bringing the profession into disrepute. So they beavered away, unbeknownst to me, for about 6 months trying to draw up a charge sheet, which I finally got in December 2021, just before Christmas. So thanks for that. And what they've done is collected a number of my tweets, 27, I think, and told me this presented a course of conduct of homophobia, transphobia and anti-Semitism. So we had lots of back and forth because I was saying that some of these tweets are utterly ridiculous. There was a couple where I was discussing Brokeback Mountain. And I'm saying, are you saying that this is an example of homophobia? Please, could you at least put them under headings? So we had this back and forth, weren't getting anywhere. And then John Holbrook won his appeal in March 2022. And because I think in the end, the BSB proceeded on the basis of only one of his tweets, which made some comment about Islam not being generally a religion of peace. And he won his appeal because he was sanctioned originally for that on the basis that this was political speech. It attracts the highest degree of protection. It should only be sanctioned if it was seriously offensive and utterly discreditable, which of course none of his tweets were. And I met John at a Free Speech Union event, and he was incredibly helpful. We talked about our respective cases. He helped me draft some of my responses to the BSB. And shortly after his appeal, of course, they had to withdraw their complaint against me because there was no way it could have succeeded. So goodness knows how much time and trouble this took. I made a data subject access request of the BSB and was quite amused to find the person they'd asked to draft the charge sheet against me was seeking help from senior members of the BSB, saying, I don't understand what I'm doing. I don't understand her tweets. What is going on here? So it took them even 6 months to cobble together some tweets, and they were never able to even put them under headings and tell me what was so specifically wrong about them. So it was a really, really bruising and upsetting experience because, of course, if your professional regulator tells you you're a horrible person, then you believe it. So it was very helpful to be able to talk to John, who was able to give me that clarity of perspective and say, no, what they're doing to you is wrong. You're not a horrible person. You're not bringing the profession into discredit. And that gave me the confidence to continue, and I was proved right. Now, I thought then sanity had dawned, but this new proposal to change the core duty makes me realise that no, the situation is returning to its previously quite insane state.
Okay, so that brings us on to the core duties of barristers. Now, there are 10 of these, and they're set out by the Bar Standards Board. And why don't you just tell us about those and the significance of them, and of number 8 in particular?
Well, they are significant because without them, the whole profession would collapse. I mean, basically, you owe a duty to the court, you owe a duty to your client, you've got to keep client affairs confidential, you've got to act to the best of your abilities, and you mustn't unlawfully discriminate. That's core duty 8. And that's obviously completely sensible. I have no issue with that. Of course, you are not entitled to discriminate against someone for the colour of their skin, their sexuality, their gender identity. That's not your job. Your job is to fearlessly advance their case, their rights protected by law before the court or tribunal. So you absolutely have to put your own personal prejudice aside. I have absolutely no problem with the core duties as they stand.
Okay, so there's already been some politicisation of the Bar Standards Board, and now there's been this proposal to change core duty number 8. Now, just take us through that.
They want to replace the duty not to unlawfully discriminate with a positive obligation to advance equality, diversity, and inclusion. I'm entirely unclear how they define any of those terms or what they mean when they say advance, and whether or not they include diversity, say, of political opinion within that. Because there have been some very worrying cases. One I wrote about in my Substack, a father who was a member of UKIP wanted to take his children out canvassing with him, and the judge ruled that there should be restrictions on his contact with his children because of that. Now, that was quite rightly overturned on appeal because that was an appalling and abhorrent judgment. He wasn't doing anything illegal. He had political views the judge didn't like. But if that new core duty comes in, would that father find any barrister willing to take his case? Because are we going to be told, well, UKIP's horrid, they don't like diversity, they don't want to encourage immigration, for example, so you can't possibly represent somebody who is a member of UKIP because you're not advancing diversity, equality. Where is this going to end? Our obligations are first to the court and a close second to our client. We promote the rule of law. We are not here to wave a flag for any particular political ideology. And it just seems to me an absolute nightmare in that a positive duty is coming in, which isn't defined and which arguably in and of itself is going to be unlawful. It's going to lead to exclusion of people who don't fit within the parameters of what is deemed worthy to be included. And the obvious example is the whole gender-critical gender identity debate. Women like me are not deemed worthy of inclusion because we're seen as horrible Nazi bigots. Well, how is this going to track into actual court cases? Will I be allowed to act at all as a barrister if someone says, well, Sarah Phillimore advocates these horribly exclusionary ideas and doesn't think men should be in female spaces because actually they're women and she refuses to recognise them as women, she can't be a barrister. I mean, where is this going to end? I'm really, really troubled by it, because I did think the response of the BSB to complaints made about me after 2022 were perfectly sensible and reasonable, and basically said she's entitled to have a view, she's not being abusive, she's not harassing anybody, there's nothing we're going to do about it. So I don't understand where this has come from, why we suddenly had a return to sanity and now this utterly bonkers. But what really shocked me, and I didn't know this, is the solicitors' profession have already been subject to a variation of this duty. I think they're told they have to promote rather than advance equality. And this has been going on since 2018. Now, I had no idea, and I don't think a lot of solicitors do, because there was a very interesting comment on my article from a solicitor who said, oh, this is all nonsense. I've never instruct a barrister who went along with this nonsense. And I thought, but you're actually under this duty already and you don't know, which in a way is heartening because it just shows how useless and ridiculous this whole thing is. But it's also very disheartening because you shouldn't have duties floating around that aren't understood, that aren't enforced. But, you know, that was an eye-opener. I had honestly no idea the solicitors already had this imposed on them. So maybe I can see why the bar thought, well, we've got to marry up to the solicitor's obligations.
And so, as you mentioned, this change would be potentially encouraging lawyers to look at and evaluate the politics of their clients or potential clients before they decided whether or not to take them up. And wouldn't this be totally violating what I thought was a very fundamental principle of being a barrister, which is the cab rank rule, right? And so can you just first, just walk us through what that rule is and why it's so important and how this change would potentially undermine it?
Well, for barristers, it means you have an obligation to accept whatever instructions are offered to you, provided they're within your field of competence and you're being paid fairly to do so. And the obvious utility of that rule, well, I hope is obvious, because that means people don't get turned away and denied representation because they are unpopular. I mean, if that were permitted, then I doubt any paedophiles or rapists would be entitled to a defence. And we are all entitled to a defence. We are all innocent until we're proven guilty. And I know when you speak to criminal lawyers and say, well, how can you act for these awful men? They'll say, I want to give them the best possible defence so there's no chance of appeal and they get locked up. This is about defending the system. And we all run the risk of being the victim of false allegations or being seen in particular light. We all need proper legal representation. Again, I go back to the example of the UKIP father who wanted to see his children. If you allow lawyers to cherry pick cases according to their own personal prejudice, then people are going to be denied legal representation. That cannot be right.
Okay, and so you'd think that these kinds of proposals would be opposed, not least by barristers, who obviously would be undermining really their entire profession. And yet there are people like Jolyon Maughan and others who are actually welcoming these changes. Another one that you've mentioned is a legal academic, Stephen Vaughan, who thinks that it's a good idea. Now, why do you think some lawyers and those around the legal profession think that this politicization of the law is a good thing?
Well, I suppose you've always got to steel man your opponent and not go for the most desperately sad interpretation of their motives. So trying to be as optimistic as I can only assume that this is driven by people with a strong sense of what they believe to be right and wrong, and not wishing in any way to be seen to promote what is wrong. Of course, the difficulty with that is they are not omnipotent and not omniscient, and they may well be wrong about what they perceive to be right. And that's why everybody gets a lawyer, no matter how disgusting you think they are. I remember Jolyon Maughan was one of the signatories of those barristers who said they would not prosecute people who were charged with offences against big oil, and nor would they defend big oil in the courts. And I just think that is missing the point so profoundly. This isn't about your moral condemnation. This is about the rule of law and a functioning legal system. And I said at the time, and I stick to this, I think any barrister who publicly declares they will not represent certain people or certain classes of people should be disbarred. They are not fit to be barristers. That is the fundamental ethical obligation of our profession.
Okay, so in terms of the scale of this problem of the politicization of the law, so you mentioned that, in fact, you were surprised to learn that solicitors already had a requirement to promote equality in their practice, and obviously now it may be coming to barristers. And then, of course, there have been recently especially widespread complaints about two-tier policing and perhaps two-tier sentencing as well. And so, well, how widespread do you think this problem is of identity politics coming and mixing with the practice and application of the law?
I think it's extremely widespread. And again, going back to my attempts to steel man, I think John Holbrook makes the very useful comments about the distinction between personal characteristics and values. I quite accept that diversity is necessary because we all have different values, and it does help to have our eyes open to how other people live and think. I'll always remember a case where I was acting for a mother who was given a terrible telling off by the judge for not writing to her child while the child wasn't in her care. Why didn't you? Well, because she couldn't read or write, that's why. But the judge had no conception of that, having come from a privileged background where people read and wrote for pleasure. So I absolutely take on board. Diversity is important in that it helps inform our values, but those values have to be objective and consistent. So I do think a lot of people have got distracted by what we mean by values. I'm a disabled person. That doesn't stop me being unpleasant and irrational. I shouldn't be appointed to any position because I'm disabled. But my disability does give me a useful perspective, and I can use that to inform my values. So I do think there's benefit and there's merit, and we should be looking to create a diverse profession because it should be accessible to everyone who has to come before it. But where I very strongly disagree is this suggestion that because you're black or because you're disabled, you will therefore have different values. That can't be right. The law has to be objective. It has to be foreseeable and accessible. So trying to do the best I can to be as kind as I can to these people, because I think the damage they're going to do is absolutely incredibly serious. I think they're all motivated by something good and noble. We all know the injustices of the past. Homosexuality was illegal. Women couldn't vote. We all know that. But the way to deal with it is not to pretend that simply by appointing people who are a particular colour, a particular gender identity is going to solve the problem. We need to know what their values are, and those values need to be consistent, identifiable, objective, and serve the purpose of the rule of law. I mean, if certain judges are going to go easy on people who are supporting the Palestinian cause because that's their own political belief, that's obviously wrong, dangerous, and corrosive to society, because we need to trust lawyers to be fair, and certainly judges.
Okay, one particular site where people have been kind of raising the alarm about the entrance of identity politics into the judiciary in particular is this thing called the Equal Treatment Bench Book. Basically, this is a guide for how judges ought to conduct themselves and their courtrooms in trials in order to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and equally. And this is given to every judge in Britain, so it has a significant effect on court proceedings. But campaigners have realised that there have been lots of elements of woke ideology that have found their way into this book, and this has resulted in outrages like female alleged victims of sexual assault being forced to refer in court to their alleged attackers as she, if they say they're trans. This is male attackers. And I mean, Sarah, how have these kinds of things entered into the Equal Treatment Bench Book and the law more widely?
Well, the Equal Treatment Bench Book is a very good example of the Trojan horse of this kind of ideology, because they've been incredibly successful. I have to take my hats off to them. What they've done is they've gone right for the top, they've infiltrated, and then it has to trickle down. And the vast majority of us are just getting on with our lives, getting on with our jobs, and we haven't noticed until it's almost too late. The Equal Treatment Bench Book used to state that you would have to refer to somebody in court by their chosen pronouns. And that led to an awful case where a woman was physically assaulted and knocked to the ground by a young man who went by the name of Tara. And this woman was told she had to refer to Tara in court as she. And she was criticised for being reluctant to do so. Now, there was quite rightly a massive uproar about that. And that part of the Equal Treatment Bench Book was changed. And there have been further significant changes and further revisions, including, I think, a chapter that once referred to gender now refers to sex. But it highlights the absolute danger of this promotion of equality and inclusion and diversity. Whose equality, diversity and inclusion are you promoting? Because for every person included, somebody's going to be excluded. For every woman who it is demanded, she says in court, must refer to her assailant as she. All right, you've got the assailant feeling pretty good about himself. You've got a devastated victim of either physical or sexual assault being gaslit by the courts. Now, that is not inclusive. That is not equality. Sometimes hard choices have to be made, and somebody's going to be feeling upset and that they weren't properly affirmed. Well, this is life, and we have to make some difficult decisions. And I certainly think the material reality of sex should take precedence over a subjective claimed gender identity in those circumstances. Of course, I'm not saying that nobody should ever claim to have a gender identity or be allowed to rely on it. But we're adults. We've got to make rational and sensible decisions. We can't just parrot these empty phrases, equality, diversity, inclusion. Well, what does this mean? Who are you including? Who are you excluding? And what precisely is equal about that? And you won't ever get a clear answer. Because, of course, what people mean who parrot these phrases is my politics, my beliefs. Those are the ones that will be included, and yours won't. And that's really, really dangerous. So I'm so glad to see the changes to the Equal Treatment Bench Book. And I suggest there has been some intervention of activist judges, one in particular who is now no longer a member of the judiciary. And I think that's to the benefit of the judiciary and society as a whole.
Yeah. And I suppose we could see this as a bit of a win here. I mean, the campaign group Sex Matters, for instance, has really been raising this issue of gender identity terminology finding its way into the Equal Treatment Bench Book. So they'll be very pleased at this. But more widely, I mean, we've talked about today, all the ways in which identity politics seems to be finding its way into the law. How vigilant do we need to be in future to make sure this doesn't keep happening and spreading?
Well, as the Bar Standards Board consultation shows, the price of our freedom is going to have to be internal vigilance. This nonsense is now so deeply rooted, we can't simply sit back on our laurels. When I thought we could, I thought a few court wins was all we needed. I thought Harry Miller and Maya Forstater had sorted this out. They haven't. Because the problem is the people pushing it firmly believe that they are righteous. That is why they are so dangerous. They are impervious to reason. They won't say, oh, we got that wrong. Actually, we've caused a lot more harm in our pursuit of noble aims than we realised. No, they are, I think, incredibly arrogant, because that's a problem when you think you're right. You don't ever have to interrogate your own motivations. Why should you? You're right. Anyone who disagrees with you is a disgusting far-right bigot. I'm not going to sully myself by having a conversation with them or drilling down into why they think what they do. And I have been naive. I thought I could rely upon the intelligence and the rationality of those people in power. And it's been a horrible, sobering realization that I cannot, that some of them are frankly so irrational that I come to doubt their fitness to hold the positions that they do. So I'm afraid we're going to have to be eternally vigilant, because this thing has such deep roots. I think it's at least 3 decades in the making. And as I've said, I applaud it. As a strategy, it was incredibly successful. And had they only been able to restrain themselves from being quite so aggressive and belligerent, there wouldn't have been the pushback that there was. I became a campaigner, if you want to grace me with that title, because in 2018, I was told by a variety of people on social media that they were going to report me to either the police or my employer. And that really woke me up. And I thought, what is happening here? That my mere gentle expression of opinion, I think I said, but hang on, you can't change sex. What's going on here? A mere expression of that opinion was enough to bring down this aggressive threat. So that immediately alerted me to the fact that there was something very wrong happening. So I think, they blew it for themselves by not being able to restrain their sense of entitlement and aggression. And a lot of people have woken up now. And I think, sadly, we're going to have to stay awake for a long time to come until we have eradicated this fully from the institutions that serve society.
Okay, well, on that note, Sarah Phillimore, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Now, you've heard of decolonising the curriculum. You've heard of affirmative action. Well, the latest idea out of the more radical end of our education establishment combines both of these bad ideas. Decolonising exams. Now, what does that even mean? And won't it undermine educational standards? Well, to tell us more about this brave new frontier in education, I'm pleased to be joined now by Stephen Tucker, a regular contributor to the Daily Sceptic and an author of 10 books, including Hitler and Stalin's Misuse of Science. Welcome to the Sceptic, Stephen.
Hello, good to be here.
Okay, so Stephen, you've written for us recently about this idea of decolonising exams. Now, this rather strange proposal originally appeared, didn't it, in a journal called Trends in Higher Education. Now, just tell us what was being proposed there.
Well, it was reported on during the summer exam season by various newspapers, and it was primarily by an academic called Dr. Pranjal, who, as you say, wants to decolonise exams. And the idea of decolonising exams is not about decolonising subject matter, so it's not about replacing white authors with black authors or anything like that. It's about actually replacing the exams, which are viewed in this school of thought as being relics of colonialism, with a new decolonised form of exams, because Dr. Pranjal and thinkers like him reckon that examinations were invented during the imperial era by white Europeans, and then they were imposed from outside, from above, upon, for example, black people, Asian people, etc. And what they test, according to this school of thought, is not actually ability per se, but rather how white your thinking is. Because they reckon that ideas such as being able to accurately recall subject knowledge is really just a white concept, which reflects the way that white cognition or white brains supposedly work. So what you're actually testing in an exam, according to this idea, according to the paper, is not how good a student you are, not how good a medic you might be, not how good whatever it is you're trying to be qualified for you would be, but rather how white you are, how much like a white person you can think. So what they want to do is completely decolonize this by replacing it by allowing non-white people to kind of devise their own assessment methods, because they see that apparently in UK degree statistics, there's a 9% gap in attainment between white people, who would tend to get 2 1s and firsts, and non-white people, of whom supposedly 9% fewer get those high grades. Dr. Pranjal and various other people like that think that maybe people from other cultures or people from other races might act or think in various different ways which aren't appropriate to be tested by white people. So, for instance, there are lab reports which science students might have to complete in standard English and so forth. And Dr. Pranjal suggests, well, this is just testing your ability to write in white English and so forth. Other cultures have traditions of storytelling, so why can't they tell the story of a chemical reaction, whatever that would mean? Or he has the idea that we can have something that he terms PBL, or project-based learning, which is basically just group work, which is actually quite an ordinary idea, and then giving a PowerPoint presentation on it to the other students. And you think, well, how is that really decolonial? Because PowerPoint is obviously a white Western invention, but he justifies it by saying that this is a form of horizontal learning, which the students, when they make the presentation, they impart knowledge to one another, which is completely unlike the top-down hierarchical imperialist model of learning, whereby there's some authority figure who's the lecturer, the teacher, whatever you might say, who imparts the knowledge, and then he determines which knowledge is correct and which knowledge is incorrect and invalid. And that's a white Western way of doing things.
And so, Stephen, I mean, someone like Dr. Pranjal would probably style himself as something of an anti-racist type, sort of standing up for oppressed minorities. But what he seems to be saying here is that essentially non-whites can't be held up to the same standards as whites in exams. I mean, isn't that itself a bit racist?
Well, you'd think so, but that's to think about it rationally. which is to think about it in a white-brained type of way. So they kind of say, this school of thought, they would argue that any arguments to that against them are simply invalid because they are simply white ways of thinking about things, which is no good, because logic and rationality are to some degree, in certain schools of thought here, are to some degree invalid. They're almost racist, which is rather convenient, isn't it? Because that makes it impossible to demolish these arguments by definition. Because if you come up with a good, perfectly rational argument, which is inarguable and you can't come back against that, then they can just say, oh, well, you're just thinking like a white person. That's no good.
And I mean, well, to most people, Stephen, these kinds of ideas will just seem quite bizarre. And so I think it's worth asking, I mean, how influential are these kinds of ideas in academia? I mean, is this just a bunch of lefty loonies on the fringe?
Well, it's not as if GCSEs and A-levels and proper tests are about to disappear tomorrow or anything like that. I mean, I wouldn't want to scaremonger to that extent. It's not as if, realistically, doctors are going to be suddenly completely unqualified or anything like that. But when it comes to... it's the problem is worse, I should imagine, in terms of tertiary education, as in universities, because the individual universities and individual course leaders tend to set their own exams and their own course content, don't they? Whereas A-levels and GCSEs, they are set by external national agencies according to government criteria. So it's going to be worse in the university sector. And it's also going to be worse, clearly, in kind of contentless non-subjects like gender studies, race studies, queer studies, that kind of thing, where you can see a genuine trend towards this kind of thing happening. There's an example I give in one of my pieces from a paper put out by the SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And they've got an example of a queer studies student from Manchester Metropolitan University. And extraordinarily, she has written, I refuse, that's the actual word that she uses, I refuse to sit my dissertation examination using standard academic terms and terminology and discourse. And instead, I demand to be assessed purely upon a random blog post or series of blog posts that I've written about being a lesbian, which, you know, you'd expect, wouldn't you, the tutors to just say, well, no, that's not the test, is it? You know, you can't just write an essay about how you're a lesbian and then expect to pass. Except here, it seems that is what's happened. So clearly, and it's been held up as an example of best practice or whatever. So there is a trend towards this in terms of, again, the contentless humanities or pseudo-humanities subjects that we hear so much about these days. But I wouldn't want to scaremonger and say that all of a sudden this is going to interfere in engineering courses to the extent that, you know, people are going to come out unable to build bridges or whatever, and that sort of thing. However, it is worth saying that a lot of this is based upon the pedagogical theories of someone called Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian Marxist. He's the most cited educational authority on teacher training courses and in the world of pedagogy. And he basically had this weird idea that Marxists like him should seize the means of knowledge production, i.e. schools, universities, etc., in order to dismantle capitalism. Because if you make it so that what teachers and lecturers are disseminating is ignorance, then capitalist society will fall apart because by definition it will be unable to reproduce itself. For instance, if you churn out loads of kids who can't add up, then how is capitalism, with its profit loss margins and so forth and accounting methods, how is it going to actually reproduce itself if accountants of the future barely even know how to use numbers? So it is rather disturbing that someone like that is the most cited authority. So, I mean, you know, things could go worse and worse, I suppose, but we're not there yet. I don't think, but there is potential for it to get worse.
I wonder if part of the reason this is taking root so much here in what I think what you call the content-free humanities is the fact that a lot of it is really dressed up in this kind of jargon. Now, I mean, if you talk about this kind of thing in plain English, non-whites get to have different exams to whites, it sounds ridiculous, right? But when it's dressed up in all this kind of abstract, highfalutin, academic jargon, it seems perhaps more convincing. Is that part of the reason this is able to sort of thrive?
Partly, yeah, because, I mean, even if you look at Dr. Pranjol's initial study, for example, he uses terms such as PBL, an initialism or an acronym, which, sounds like it has some academic justification, but actually it just means project-based learning or people giving presentations in plain English. It's completely unnecessary jargon, isn't it? It's pseudo-professional, really, rather than truly academic. And terms such as equity, which, again, it's obfuscatory, really. It hides what the true meanings are. Another one is authentic assessment. Now, I mean, that sounds good, doesn't it? If you have in a university prospectus, we practice modes of authentic assessment. Well, the word authentic, it's generally taken to be, a positive thing, a positive word, a good thing. But if you actually look what that term means in this context, it just means being authentic to oneself, as in, rather than doing ordinary examinations like multiple choice exams or essay-based, time-based exams or whatever, instead, you can choose to do whatever your own personal examination would be. And the actual examples given in the SOAS paper are stuff like making posters, making songs or pieces of music, little presentations, your own films. And one example honestly given is poetry. So if you'd rather write a poem about, I don't know, being gay or something, then that apparently is now an acceptable assessment method. But even in terms of, we're talking about language, in Dr. Pramjol's paper, he criticises the need for students to be able to communicate in standard English, even though he writes in standard English, or what approximates for it in modern academia, as being in some sense requiring all students, even those with non-white brains, as it were, to conform to some kind of imperialistic style standard. Whereas in actual fact, it's just a simple common sense requirement. For example, to go back to medical things again, there have been some examples of qualified, perfectly well qualified and knowledgeable medics in the West, in UK, who sadly can't speak English properly, and so they're not able to diagnose the patients correctly because they can't understand what they're saying in terms of what the symptoms are, and they can't communicate to them what the correct treatments would be. And there was one case where I think a German doctor, he completely misunderstood the situation and his patient died. So if they're saying that language doesn't matter, they're completely incorrect. So but yeah, I do think that a lot of this jargon is just there to obscure the fact that the emperor has no clothes and to make them sound more professional and knowledgeable than they themselves really are. They act as kind of like hierophants, guardians of knowledge in some sense. But the real truth is the knowledge isn't there. It's absent. So yeah, the language is a cloak.
Okay, so we've been talking about SOAS there and its embrace of some of these concepts in what's called it's got its own decolonising philosophy toolkit, and that's for schools, sixth forms and universities. And as part of that, it's got this quite strange idea of something called crip time, which we'll get into in a second. But this crip time idea comes from something called crip theory. There's this idea, along with disciplines like queer theory as well, that you can sort of reclaim these labels and say, actually, no, it's a point of pride, it's a point of celebrating one's identity. But I think to most people, the existence of even the name of this discipline, crip theory, it almost just sounds like an insult, doesn't it? I mean, what's going on here, Stephen?
Well, yeah, it does sound like an insult, doesn't it? But they attempt to turn the insult that around into a compliment. For example, cripple or crippled, in the terms of we normally think of physically disabled, but it can also apply to like mentally disabled and so forth. But they turn it round and say, no, you're the real cripples, you like cognitively normal people, because you don't have access to our superior other ways of knowing. For example, if you think about autistic people, some of them have, it's traditionally been seen as a disability, but some of them do, like Alan Turing, for example, have the World War II codebreaker. They might have particularly good numerical skills or computer coding skills these days, that type of thing. So they'd say to be crippled is actually to be superpowered, and to be normal-brained or normal-minded is to be the true cripples. So actually, crippled is a compliment. It's not an insult at all. Is what they would say. So that they have completely turned that around. And again, it's all about demonising normativity, really, because if you look at, take the example of Alan Turing again, he was not only crippled mentally, supposedly, although he wasn't really, because he was actually very intelligent, wasn't he? Because he was apparently autistic. He was also non-normative in the sense that he was gay, wasn't he? So he was doubly superpowered. He was doubly non-normative. He was doubly, by analogy, non-white, even though obviously he was white. Nonetheless, by being gay and like neurologically divergent, as they say, he was metaphorically non-white. So to them, cripple does not mean an insult. And in fact, people should aspire to be crippled. And SOAS themselves specifically in the decolonising philosophy toolkit say all students should be potentially treated as if they are crippled, and they should be assessed not merely by normative white, as it were, modes of testing, but according to what they term cripistemologies, including crip time, which I think is what we'll get onto next.
Okay, so you have this bizarre idea of crip theory, which has been taken up by the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, this Russell Group University, and now they want to introduce crip time into assessments. Now, I mean, Stephen, what is this? Explain crip time for us.
Well, basically, crip time is the idea that clocks are sort of racist in a way, or prejudiced against the neurologically non-normative, because apparently, I'm not familiar with which particular disabilities you're talking about, but apparently certain disabled people perceive time in a different way to normatively brained persons. And I suppose everyone perceives time in a certain different way. I mean, some people think time passes quickly, other people think it passes slowly. However, traditional exams tend to be timed, don't they? You have 90 minutes to complete your essays, to finish all the questions. However, what if you have one of these non-normative brains, and to you 90 minutes just seems like 90 seconds, and what you're really being tested on there is your ability to be normal-brained in terms of your perception of time. So maybe we should elongate what time means and redefine what this standard 90 minutes is, and just allow everyone to sit exams in their own good time. A bit like these days, you do have like special needs students sometimes given extra time in exams, don't we? Like, for example, someone who's physically disabled and they can't write as quickly because they've got something wrong with their hands or whatever, or the motor skills, they might be given an extra half an hour, and perfectly justifiably so, I suppose. But SOAS's argument appears to be, by extending crip time to whoever wants it, everyone could be special needs potentially, because they do say everyone should be treated with, as a crip almost. But this is ridiculous, because if everyone has special needs, then nobody has special needs. The analogy I make in my piece on the website is that if everyone was a millionaire, like in, say, I don't know, the Weimar Republic due to hyperinflation, then no one is a millionaire because everyone's got the same amount of money. So if everyone's classified as having special needs, then no one's got special needs, and that initial advantage given to the genuinely disabled is actually rather cancelled out. But they seem to take it even further and saying that, well, maybe we should get rid of timed assessments altogether and just allow pupils to be tested over several months simply by keeping learning diaries, whatever they might be, just kind of, I suppose, learning logs of today I learned such and such a thing, and then handing these in later on. So it's just, I think it's more just a vehicle for demonising normativity, really.
Okay, well, Stephen Tucker, thanks very much for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me. I'll see you again in the future, I'm sure.
Now, Sir Keir Starmer's career before politics would seem to mark him out as a bleeding heart liberal. As a human rights barrister, he notoriously defended murderers from around the world pro bono, in order to oppose the death penalty. This included a Jamaican man who killed his girlfriend and their 9-month-old son. Even as Director of Public Prosecutions, he was warning against the chilling effect on free speech of prosecutions for social media posts. But where are those human rights principles now? As part of his crackdown following the Southport riots, a grandmother has been fast-tracked into prison for a Facebook post, and Starmer has pledged to roll out illiberal facial recognition technology to surveil the British public. So what gives? Why is a liberal lefty lawyer suddenly so comfortable being an authoritarian? And what does this mean for life under Labour? Well, to answer those questions, I'm very pleased to welcome back to The Sceptic Professor David McGrogan, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Northumbria and the author of the Uncibal Substack. Welcome to The Sceptic, David.
Hi, Laurie. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Now, David, you've written recently on what you call Keir Starmer's liberal authoritarianism, which obviously will seem like a bit of a paradox. I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very important question. It has sort of two elements to it, I think. So one of them is to do with human rights, and one of them is to do with Keir Starmer. So taking things in that order. So human rights, you must not fall into the trap of thinking that human rights in the modern era is a means of constraining state power in the kind of classical liberal conception. That's not what human rights are for nowadays. Human rights now are really best thought of as a kind of a political tool, designed or deployed to shape state power in a particular way in order to achieve a particular political objective. So that might be, for example, we see that in the context of immigration, where human rights is kind of picked up and used as a tool for protecting a class of people, asylum seekers and migrants, in the name of a kind of vision of society as multicultural and internationalized and globalized. So it's not really that human rights are being used to constrain the power of the state. They're actually used to expand the capacity of the state to take on this kind of migrant population. Another example would be, we've seen quite a lot of cases where human rights law has been used to more or less prevent the state from cutting back on welfare. So again, it's kind of almost not exactly constraining the power of the state. It's almost the opposite. It's kind of like bolstering the size of the state, at least in respect of welfare or in respect of kind of social security. So, and we also saw it in respect of that famous decision, quite recent one, regarding the Swiss government's failure to protect the population from the effects of climate change, right? So again, that's not about constraining state power. That's actually expanding the power of the state or expanding the kind of the scope of state authority. So that's what human rights law has now become. And there is an interesting kind of historical reason for that. So historians of human rights have identified that, after 1968, after the sort of failure of left revolution in Western democracies, left thought kind of moved in the direction of human rights almost as a sort of an alternative to democratic methods or revolutionary methods. It was almost a sort of, you might think of it as a kind of almost like the judicial wing of left activism. So left activism became quite heavily focused in human rights law as a kind of deploying it as a tool to achieve, let's say, sort of revolutionary objectives through through the judiciary or through law. So there is a historical reason why things have moved in that direction, and people who are interested in that subject can read. There's quite a famous book called The Last Utopia by a professor at NYU called Samuel Moyn, which goes into that a little bit. I mean, Moyn is a leftist himself, but he kind of charts a bit of that history and sort of explains it. So that's human rights. Starmer himself now. So it's very, I think people also will intuit this as well. And, you have to play armchair psychologist a little bit here in understanding Starmer's motives. But readers might be familiar with George Orwell's, The Road to Wigan Pier. There's a section towards the end of The Road to Wigan Pier where Orwell kind of gives a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of the psychology of the average socialist. And he kind of paints this picture of the socialist as being not really particularly compassionate. They're not actually all that interested in empathizing with other people, although they kind of dress themselves up as being very empathetic and compassionate. What they really like is order. What they really like is the imposition of a kind of mechanical approach to society where everybody knows their place. Everybody's like a cog in this kind of great machine that's operating. Everybody gets, a kind of equal proportion of the national wealth, so to speak, right? They all get kind of, their little chunk of the pie, and it's all equal. But the equality, the reason why they like equality is because it allows this sort of very orderly, mechanical society to operate. And I think Starmer's very much in that mold. He doesn't create the impression that he's a particularly compassionate man or a particularly empathetic man. He actually really creates the impression that he's quite a rigid authoritarian in his kind of psychological composition, right? He likes the idea that everybody in society does what they're supposed to do, and they're all joined together in this great sort of grand scheme, right, that he and his comrades are going to be in charge of. That I think that comes through very, very noticeably, I think, in his public appearances, where he's just very awkward interacting with ordinary human beings. He sees ordinary people almost as chess pieces or tools or things to kind of manipulate and operate on, rather than actual kind of genuine equals, in the sense that an equal is somebody who is deserving of equal respect and has their own point of view and has their own ideas and their own needs and their own desires and so forth. He doesn't seem to take that particularly seriously or really think about that very, very hard. So there is an element of his psychological composition that I think is also important.
Yeah. And so on to your next piece then. So you've written about how sort of the technocratic mode of government almost makes our rulers end up being disappointed when they find that the technocratic mode of government doesn't work with the public. And this is, encapsulated in kind of the tone, in fact, that Starmer has been striking in some of his recent speeches. It's almost like he's disappointed in us, and he says things like, after the Southport riots in particular, he says there's no excuses for this, and he's sort of hectoring people. And now, while it's true that the rioting is bad and it should be condemned, I think he was quite unable there to not only condemn it, but also to say, I understand that at the same time there are some legitimate grievances here, and there's some reasons that people are angry, and to sort of reach across the divide in that way, right? I mean, why do people like Starmer sort of end up in the situation where they're almost frustrated with what the public is actually like?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's this kind of finger-wagging disappointment that he slips very easily into that mode, right? If you're trying to describe him to a foreign audience in one word, I think unconciliatory is a really, really good. It captures his approach to everything. He doesn't like meeting people halfway. He doesn't like this idea that there's give and take in politics, right? And that the point of politics, in fact, is to respond flexibly to the ineluctable fact that there has to be give and take, right? That there's no way that everyone in society is going to agree on anything. So politics has to be conciliatory. It has to find a way. That's what politics, the essence of politics is, right? Is to find a way to make decisions in such a way that you are allowing these different competing needs, competing preferences in society to rub along together. He just doesn't get that. And it's one sort of thought experiment that I've been kind of sort of ruminating over ever since the riots, is just trying to imagine what Tony Blair would have been like if he'd have been Prime Minister when that happened. Whatever you might want to say about Tony Blair understood the conciliatory nature of politics, right? There's no way that he would have been that authoritarian in his response, given that, of course, and I ought to be completely clear about this, there is no excuse for rioting, right, in terms of creating physical or the threat of physical harm, right, especially directed at, a particular class of people, right? So there is no excuse for rioting in that sense. And I think we can agree with Starmer about that. But what Blair would have done would have been to deal or to give a strong lead in a kind of police response, if you like, the judicial response. But he would have understood the need to strike a conciliatory tone, because he would have understood that there is a genuine grievance about immigration kind of bubbling underneath those riots, right? But Starmer is he's just not in the same league as Tony Blair as a politician, right? And I'm speaking here, if you set ideology, set opinions to one side, he just isn't a political operator who has the same capacities as Tony Blair. So what you're also seeing is just, this government of mediocrities as well. So as well as being ideological, and as well as being unconciliatory and kind of, having these kind of quite authoritarian instincts, they're also mediocre. So they're also not very skillful politicians. And the fact that they're not skillful politicians will lead them into hot water, because that is what will lead to this quite angry, knee-jerk reaction. And I think we'll see that again and again and again, that this government, because they don't really know what they're doing, because they don't really understand the nature of politics, they will find themselves becoming frustrated. And that will actually come through in the way that they interact with the population.
Okay, so I think you make a pretty strong case that the messaging hasn't been very good, and maybe the ability to read the public mood. But in terms of the sort of policy agenda, so Starmer has been saying, hasn't he, that he's been trying to sort of put out this message that things are going to get worse, but they're going to make tough decisions. They were handed a big mess by the Tories, and after all that, things are going to get better. And so if we sort of put the messaging aside, should we not be giving him and his sort of policy agenda a chance?
Well, there's two things to say there as well. So the first thing, let's deal with the kind of in reverse order. So the policy agenda first. What you will have noticed about the policy agenda is how threadbare it is. So it's one thing to say things are really bad, and I think most people would agree with that, right? That things are really bad in the country. I think there are economic problems, there are social problems, and there's also just a problem of morale. There's almost like a spiritual problem that people just don't see the future in positive terms, right? And it's palpable in the country that's the case, right? So he's indisputably correct that things are really bad, but that's the very, very strong emphasis on how bad things are, right? And the plan, so to speak, is how that will be improved is almost non-existent. I don't want to say it's entirely non-existent, but and that speech he gave in the Rose Garden, people can read the text if they Google it, the full text of that speech. And once they read it, they'll realize just exactly how thin the policy proposals are, because what he basically says is right at the start, right? Okay, I'm in favor of growth, right? We want growth, we want wealth creation. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a national wealth fund, right? Which is firstly is going to be tiny, but secondly it's not going to be like the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, where they take the takings from the oil fields in the North Sea and they plunge that into the sovereign wealth fund. This is just going to basically be borrowed money. So they're just going to borrow money to put it. It's like, you go to the bank and you take out a loan of £10,000 and then put it in a savings account, which pays lower interest rate. It's just that's not a credible plan to achieve wealth creation. And whenever you look at the policies, the policies that Labour are coming up with, what is it? Well, it's big payouts to public sector employees. It's tax rises. So the burden of proof is really on them to show, is there any country in the history of mankind which has managed to achieve growth by paying more money to public sector workers and taxing people more than they're taxed already? I don't think there's a country in economic history that's achieved that. maybe I'm wrong. I'd be delighted to hear if there was. But that seems to be what the plan is. So, things are really, really bad, and they're going to get worse. But the way to make things better is higher taxes. That's not credible, I'm afraid. And I'd be very surprised if anyone in the country really thinks that there is a credible plan, apart from kind of diehard Labour aficionados.
Okay, so as you mentioned, in fact, the policy agenda is pretty threadbare. And one of the ways, therefore, that they've been trying to differentiate themselves from the Tories, Labour, is by saying essentially that they're the more moral party, that they're unlike the sort of years of corruption of the Tories, or however they want to put it. In fact, let me just play you a bit from his Rose Garden speech where he sort of sets that out.
The cracks in our foundations laid bare, weakened by a decade of division and decline, infected by a spiral of populism which fed off cycles of failure of the last government.
Okay, so a lot of these admittedly are sort of stock phrases that maybe don't mean that much, but if we're to try and draw out the meaning, it's something like the idea that Labour are not like they're the grown-ups, essentially. They're not silly like the Tories, they're serious, and they're coming in to sort of make things better after these years of division or whatever they'd call it. And so, well, what do you make of this rather sort of high-handed idea, perhaps, that Labour are coming in to now clean up politics?
Well, they do always do this. This is a kind of Labour, like it's a perennial. I mean, Tony Blair was the same, right? Because it was the whole thing when Tony Blair came in was that, the Tories, it was sleaze, it was, these sex scandals and cash for questions and all that kind of thing. So that's not new in a way. And that's kind of what Labour always likes to present itself as doing, right? It's kind of coming along and cleaning up politics. But, you got an insight into I mean, I don't know how you read those that section that you've just highlighted in his speech, but I mean, well, the first thing to say about it is that they present themselves as being the grown-ups in the room who have all this expertise and kind of that's another big play that they're making, is that they're much more competent. They're going to do things really well. They're much more kind of accomplished than the Tories were, but they can't even come up with a compelling metaphor. I mean, infected by a spiral of, it's like, well, what does that even mean? It's just kind of like, it's like a word salad, isn't it? It's unbelievable how kind of like, again, how thin and threadbare the actual political rhetoric is. It's just so bad as a piece of political rhetoric. But the other thing about it is that they're still obsessed with Brexit, right? Still in the background. So in their mind, so in Keir Starmer's mind, what happened was the country was all hunky-dory, right? Until 2016, right? Admittedly, yes, there was a Tory government then, but it was a kind of like a nice Tory government, which had been sort of, for a long time, had been like ameliorated by the Liberal Democrats, right? The Liberal Democrats had kind of like diluted the Toryism. And then you got the Tory government elected in 2015. And yeah, that was bad. But David Cameron, basically, he was a decent guy, maybe just slightly misguided. But then 2016, you had this referendum where Boris, right, evil Boris, nasty, immoral, naughty Boris came along and kind of tipped over the apple cart, right, and sold people this kind of snake oil dream, that they were going to leave the European Union and everything would be better. And that the reason why the country's in a position it's in is because of that, right? That people were unhappy, and Boris kind of sold them this snake oil. And Starmer uses that phrase a lot, right? Snake oil. That he's going to make everything better, and that union of kind of Boris and his cronies and the populist kind of sentiments of the population, the kind of deluded populist sentiments of the population, have combined together and ruined everything. And we're gonna fix it, right? So essentially, you get that kind of deputy head teacher motif again, don't you? It's like Boris is like the naughty boy in like one of those kind of 1950s sort of boarding school novels, right? He's like he's like Draco Malfoy almost. Like he's kind of this, just this sinister, malign force in the school, and the deputy head teacher's going to get him sorted out. He's going to restore order. So they're really caught up in this Brexit derangement syndrome still, and a lot of that actually comes from and I'm not just tarring Labour with this brush, because I think it's true across the piece. The British chattering classes are very, very strongly influenced by America, right? They're very, although they present themselves as being very worldly and very cultivated and what have you, they actually imbibe so much of their cultural framing from what's happening in America. And so you get this kind of shadowing of what the American sort of soft left thinks about Donald Trump. You get this kind of, it's almost like a kind of shadow of that, or a kind of reflection of that coming across the Atlantic, where it's not Trump, it's Boris, right? And, the threat to democracy there is, his evil scheme to kind of overturn our membership in the EU. And James O'Brien wrote that book, didn't he? I think it's called How They Broke Britain or something like that. Well, it's that similar sort of a sentiment, right? There's this idea that everything was great before, and all these nasty Brexiteers ruined things with their snake oil and their spiral of whatever it was, infecting people with their spiral of something or other. And so we need to come along and clear everything up. And it shows more about, I think it's more to do with their internal psychology. That's what they think they're doing, right? That's what their mission is to restore the apple cart, right? We'll just reverse things to 2016, and how things used to be, and everything will be all right.
Okay, so finally, I wanted to ask you about this extraordinary spectacle we saw last week, which was Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions referring to his opposite number, Rishi Sunak, as the Prime Minister 5 times.
And the Prime Minister knows the framework. It requires serious consideration. And the Prime Minister knows the legal framework. It's the same test for all licences that the Prime Minister knows. I don't think the Prime Minister is really inviting me to...
Now, I mean, he did this once back in July, but that was, 2 or 3 weeks, I think, into the job after being in opposition for 4 years. So perhaps we might forgive him the habit in that case. But I mean, 5 times in one session of PMQs after being in the job for 2 months. I mean, what did you make of that, David?
Yeah, well, it's very Freudian, isn't it? It's I mean, on the one hand, you can excuse him from just a slip of the tongue because he is used to, obviously he's been leader of the opposition for years, so he's used to saying the Prime Minister when he's dealing with Rishi Sunak. But it is very strange that he wasn't able to correct himself. It's almost like one of those kind of tics that reveals something going on like under the surface, right? And I think it just reveals that he's firstly he's very, very comfortable in the mode of a barrister, right? In the mode of it, because he was obviously a barrister and he was a public prosecutor as well, of course, for a period of time. So he's comfortable in that accusatory frame, right? He's comfortable in dissecting something somebody said to point out the flaws or the hypocrisies or the slips of the tongue and what have you. He likes doing that, right? And it's what he's good at, I suppose. He may have built his career on doing that. What he's not good at doing is all the things that you want a prime minister to do, right? A prime minister is not supposed to be accusatory, right? A prime minister is supposed to be the opposite of accusatory. A prime minister is supposed to bring the country together. It's supposed to be, kind of reconciling the different needs and desires of the population, while also pursuing, obviously, a policy, trying to build consensus. So that's what you want in a prime minister. And again, to go back to that's what Tony Blair was very good at, right? Starmer is just not in that mold at all. He likes accusing. He doesn't like governing, right? And more broadly, I think that's just very, very true of the Labour Party. The position that the Labour Party's got itself into, which is that they like being the opposition. They like, the purity of being in opposition. Because when you're in opposition, you don't need to worry about these different competing interests, right? Outside of your own party. You can just, safe in opposition, you can just kind of throw rocks from the sidelines and point out the holes in the government's policy. And then, go home to bed, satisfied that you've done a good day's work. That's not really what goes on in government, right? That's the opposite in government. So, and they don't really like that. It sits uncomfortably with them because they have this. I mean, they are ideologues as well as being technocrats, right? So they don't like this idea that they're going to have to compromise. They're going to have to be conciliatory. To go back to that word. So I think there was something revealing in that slip of the tongue. That there is a kind of a very obvious armchair psychologist reading of that. Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, David McGrogan, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks a lot. It was great.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, You'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log into the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.